Why is God silent here? So yeah, God is very silent in his life. God doesn't seem to be there. God is doing nothing for these peasants hanging over the pit. Where's God? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a good question.
My friends, welcome to The Literary Catholic, a program where we unpack life-changing stories from centuries of Catholic literature, connecting you to God and inspiring both your faith and imagination.
We are here today with Dr. Paul Lakeland, who is a writer and recently retired professor who was the Aloysius P. Kelly Professor of Catholic Studies and Director of Catholic Studies at Fairfield University. Among his many publications, he's written a book on faith and reading, The Wounded Angel, Fiction and the Religious Imagination, and has recently co-authored the book Success on the Sound, A History of Fairfield University. Professor Lakeland has generously agreed to come today and speak with us about Shusaku Endo's novel, Silence. Now, Silence is a novel that some people may be familiar with indirectly through the 2016 Martin Scorsese film adaptation, but in general, I think Endo is fairly unknown to U.S. audiences. So to begin, I'd ask you just to tell us a little bit about who was Endo and what was his relationship to Catholicism.
Sure. It's a great pleasure to be here to do that. And you're right, Endo is little known, and if he is known, it's only really with this book. And many other books, very well known as a writer in Japan in his own right. And of course, he's known a little bit now through the movie that you mentioned. But he was born in 1923 in Japan, and I guess born into a Buddhist family. But at the age of 11, with his mother, he converted to Catholicism. Now, Japanese Catholicism today, this is a tiny group of people, so it's an unusual thing to be. And it's sometimes, I think, maybe an uncomfortable thing to be in an entirely Buddhist culture. So he grew up as a Catholic. He studied quite a bit in France, where he, I think, probably came under the influence. This would have been in the 1940s, 50s. And he probably got to know the work of a French author, François Mauriac, and a number of others. There's a very lively culture at that time in France, not that it isn't now, but particularly Catholic culture at that time. He probably came across Graham Greene there. And then he was back in Japan for a while, then came back to France, partly for more education, partly because he was ill for a while. But he spent most of the rest of his life in Japan, writing many different things, one of which is this book that we have here. And this is probably the book of all his work that brings the question of what is it to be Japanese and Catholic into the forefront of his thinking.
Yeah. Well, and you alluded to it's a relatively uncommon thing to be Japanese and to be Catholic, and part of this novel is giving us the history of why that is, at least some of the history of why that is, that it's so uncommon. And so to kind of help orient us to the novel before we launch into it fully, I was hoping you could also maybe give us a little bit of this kind of setting the scene of the historical context of Japan in the 17th century.
Sure. I mean, you have to do that. None of us really, unless we're Japanese, are really in touch with that. Of course, a name that most people would know is the name of Francis Xavier. And Xavier arrived in Japan in 1549. So that's the beginning. And he didn't stay all that long because he decided that it was more important to convert the Chinese before the Japanese. And he died before he could even begin that work. So he was in Japan for a little while, and there were some converts, but it was actually a couple of years later under another missionary, Alessandro Valignano, that the numbers began to pick up. And we're talking, before too long, somewhere around 200,000 Catholics, not spread across the entirety of Japan, but more or less, I think, in the broad area around the city of Nagasaki, which pops up in this story, of course. The problem was that for political reasons, it might be, we could go into it if you want to, but it's probably a bit complicated. It ended up with the Buddhist establishment becoming very suspicious, not so much of the religion, but of the political and geopolitical impact of all these Christian missionaries coming in. And so they began to, they worked towards outlawing Christianity. So by stages, you move in the late 16th century, 1590, somewhere around there, you've got this situation where it is now illegal to be Catholic. And that hasn't stopped missionaries. But missionaries are going to be captured and tortured or thrown out of the country or executed. It just depends on who's in charge at the time, how severe that's going to be. The Edict of Expulsion. So the final decision, we're going to expel all of these foreigners, came in 1614. So that's about, 75 years after Francis Xavier. And this didn't stop missionaries coming or missionaries even being there. And there was a famous one, a real man who actually also shows up in the novel, Cristobal Ferreira, who worked very prominently in Japan. And then in 1632, according to the stories, we're not sure, apostatized, abandoned his faith publicly after having been imprisoned and tortured for quite a significant amount of time. So here we are at the point that the book begins. The book begins, it's set in, I think 1638 is the date that it begins. And the idea is that these missionaries, these young people from Portugal, are coming to Japan for two reasons. One, to continue to be missionaries, and two, to find out what happened to Ferreira, because they don't believe that he could ever have apostatized. He was their teacher in Portugal. He was a spiritual leader and obviously was a significant spiritual influence even in Japan for a long period of time. How could this possibly have happened to our hero? So they've got these two reasons to go to Japan, but they know they're going into a situation which is full of peril.
Yeah. And that begins us so beautifully into the action of the novel, right? And so we have the three Jesuits set out, only two make it all the way, and the two will end up being separated. But you start to describe what is their understanding of their mission as they begin, and how does that change as the novel unfolds, especially maybe through Rodriguez, since we stay with him?
Garpe. This the two that you mentioned. So Rodriguez, Sebastian Rodriguez, and Garpe. Look at him for a minute first, because Garpe is the classic figure. He goes in, he works as a missionary, he's caught, he refuses to give in to them, and he dies trying to save peasants who are being tortured. Well, there's a sort of a classic martyr's death, right? No complexity at all there. And of course, with Garpe, we never get inside his head. We only see what happens from the outside. So he fits the pattern, and this is the martyr. Rodriguez, who's the central character, that's a very different story. And, what we see in him, the period of time that we're looking at is no more than a couple of years, really. But we see in him, more than a couple of years if you start from Portugal, because it takes him about 2 years to get to Japan.
Get there. Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
And what you see is what you have to call, I think, a growing understanding of the complexity and ambiguity and darkness of what the missionary activity may involve. So at the beginning, he's in Portugal. he's a blue-eyed boy. He probably isn't blue-eyed, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And he's ready to go. He's expecting, to do great things for Christ. He has this image of Jesus. The face of Jesus is important. He has this image of Jesus as a sort of blue-eyed European, right? Like the Mormon Jesus that we see all over the place. Although he was Portuguese, perhaps he didn't see him that way, but he certainly thought of Jesus as a gentle Jesus, meek and mild kind of figure. And he's ready to go. And once he arrives in Japan, immediately he sees that this is not an easy world. And the peasants he encounters initially, who are at least kind of Catholic, they say they are Catholic, they seem to be Catholic, they are not living a life that looks like gentle Jesus, meek and mild, is looking after them. It's very difficult, poverty-stricken, and terrified that the authorities will discover that they are Christians, Catholics, and will, torture them, cause them to apostatize, maybe just take their money away, but somehow or other do something terrible to them. So from that first moment he gets into Japan, the story begins to darken, and his understanding of what it means to be, not to be a Catholic, certainly, but to be a missionary, to be an apostle, to be to be holy, maybe even to be a martyr. Who knows? It becomes deeper and deeper and more complex, and I know it's interesting that when you think about that development, you know this from the book, but maybe some of the people seeing this will not know this. The book's written from in several literary forms through the book, right? So the beginning of the book is very impersonal. The prologue just lays out some facts about these people, somewhat the way we've been doing. And then we get close to a half of the book, 4 chapters, of first-person accounts by Sebastian Rodrigues of his experiences, exploits, and so on. That's really the period in which he's doing okay. He still thinks this might work out. And then at the end of those four chapters, he's captured. And of course, when he's captured, he's not going to be writing letters back to Portugal any longer. But from the author's point of view, there's a dramatic switch to an external, impersonal, third-person narrator, and now we begin the voice of the narrator begins to explore the inner workings of the mind of this man, whereas in the earlier part, we just see how he sees it. And, I don't think it's a surprise that there's room for self-deception when you are trying to figure things out for yourself, and it's a very complicated situation. Once we get to the second half of the book, there's no self-deception. There's an exploration of how complicated, how to and fro this whole thing is. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's so many threads we could follow there. But I think that you bring in, we started with sort of the mystery, right? With the mystery, what happened to Ferreira. And now we're moving into almost the psychological thriller kind of elements of it, right? Exploring his interiority. And within that, we continue that image of the face of Jesus that you started us with, which was this sort of nice Jesus. But it stays with him throughout the novel. And that face of Jesus, of course, becomes really important to the sort of crisis moment of the novel too for the priest. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about that significance of the image of Jesus for him as he pictures Jesus?
Yeah, well, of course, there's two sides to this. One, exactly what you said, that the face of Jesus is sort of a part of his spirituality, his personal spirituality. And initially, it's a fairly standard not in a bad way, pious understanding of Jesus that many people would have who never encounter major conflicts in their lives and hence major conflicts in their religious lives. But the face of Jesus begins to become more complicated for him, well, first because he sees the peasants, the Japanese peasants who are Catholic, as basically, Christ is in these people, and these people are hurting. And so he begins to start thinking about the suffering Christ, which he hasn't done an awful lot about at the beginning of the book, the suffering Christ. And then, excuse me, the important thing that nobody would know unless they started reading this book is that particular form, that the particular form of apostasy that is to be demonstrated to satisfy the Japanese. I shouldn't say the Japanese authorities, because some of the Japanese are Catholic.
Of course.
And this is this thing called a fumi, F-U-M-I-E, which is a wooden board with a face of Jesus on it. Now, somebody painted that face on there at some point. We don't know what it was like, because so many people have done what they were forced to do by the authorities, put their foot on the face of Jesus, that it's been worn down. So it looks beaten up. It looks, you could say, suffering. And he, like everyone else who's going to apostatize, including his predecessor, is going to be asked to put their foot on this face. Well, in a way, that's asking them to do something horrible for them. But in a way, it's also asking them to, the authorities don't see it this way, it's inviting them to an identification with the suffering Jesus. So we've got this face of Jesus changing all the way through in Rodriguez's mind, and at the same time, the face of Jesus beginning to appear very concretely on this object that is used to signify that you are ready to apostatize. Yeah.
And there seems to be something, I mean, on the part of the Japanese officials who put this kind of form of torment together, there seems to be something sort of spiritually and psychologically acute about this method that they've decided upon. Because, of course, you have terrible physical torment as well, which we associate often with martyrs. But to step upon the image seems to create some sort of internal conflict. Is there any way in which this form of particular inducing of apostasy is sort of there to create the conditions of wondering about God's presence?
Well, yeah, I think so. First of all, of course, they're not just being asked to apostatize, or Sebastian anyway, Rodriguez, is not just being asked to apostatize any more than Ferreira was before him. He's being asked, invited to apostatize to save other people from terrible torture. Right? So the peasants are being suspended upside down over a pit with small incisions in their flesh under their ears so that the blood will drip out slowly. And this apparently can take days and days of intense pain. And Ferreira before him and Rodriguez are being told, apostatize and we'll release them. They have already apostatized many times over. But that's the psychological torture that Rodriguez is, and I think Ferreira, are going through. That they want, I must publicly deny everything I believe for a very good purpose, to save these people. So does that answer you? I'm not sure if it does.
No, I think it does. I think it does, because I think it's this experience is in part engineered to create an experience of God's silence, right?
Yeah. Well, of course, that's running all through the book. Once they get to Japan, anyway, because you've got this. I mean, the classical term, as you know, is the term theodicy, right? This understanding of how God's goodness can be compatible with apparently innocent suffering. And all through the book, from the beginning, once he reaches Japan, the peasants are suffering in multiple ways, and as the book says, periodically, and God is silent. That's the title of the book, right?
Absolutely.
Silence. Why is God silent here? So yeah, I mean, that is exactly, that is intensified for Rodriguez as we approach the crisis in the book, because God is very silent in his life. God doesn't seem to be there. God is doing nothing for these peasants hanging over the pit. Where's God?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a good question.
Well, absolutely, and that might be the question I ask back to you, right? Is the where's God, and also, how does this novel invite us to think about silence as this classic, as you described, challenge to faith, but also perhaps in another way, a sort of beginning to faith, right? Is there a way that the novel can operate in both those ways?
Well, it's certainly a challenge to faith. That's the easy part, right? Because no one seems to be doing well in this story at all. It's not as if God is helping out some people and not others. All the faithful Christians are suffering in the silence of God. That's what it looks like. But then you have to start thinking about what's happening to Rodriguez as he approaches the moment of putting his foot on the fumi. And this would also, I think, be true for any of the people who apostatize, whether it's Ferreira or one of the peasants. First, it's under duress. How real is it? It certainly isn't. I guess I'm not a moral theologian and I might horrify somebody, but I don't think it's sinful to apostatize under severe duress. It may be unheroic, but I don't think it's sinful. So the thing that I keep coming back to in the book, and it's an obvious thing in many ways, is that the inner turmoil, the spiritual angst, terror that Sebastian Rodriguez shows is not the terror of someone who does not believe.
Right.
It's the terror of someone who does not want to do something that will look like he's abandoning belief. If he didn't believe, what's the problem? Put your foot on the piece of wood and off you go, you're free. But that doesn't happen. So, I mean, what does it tell us about, God knows, I hope none of us are ever in a similar situation, but what does it tell us about crises of faith? I mean, I suppose, I'm not sure I know what it means, what it tells us, but it tells, it's not just darkness, If you're in inner turmoil, which people maybe are, throughout their lives, all of us throughout our lives, there are moments when things are not as straightforward as we might have thought, even religiously. But that isn't the end of the story. we go on beyond that. And I think Rodrigues goes on beyond that in a way where he is much humbler than he was to begin with, than he was for most of the story. So now I think I've wandered away from the question you were asking, which probably because it's so hard.
It is. It's incredible. Well, notably, no one has ever answered exactly the theodicy question. But I wonder, you started us with the way that Rodrigues goes from a sort of quite pious image of Christ to this suffering Christ. And I wonder how this kind of crisis of faith may allow his ideas of God to change in a way that may end up deepening, certainly complexifying his faith, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it does that. I mean, I think at the moment when he puts his foot on, or he's about to put his foot on the fumi, he has this vision of Christ, the Christ on the wooden block. The fumi speaks to him and says, go ahead, trample on me. That's what I came for. And then you can look back through the book quite a bit and see places where you see references to the idea that God is there. God's not there for the good people. God's not there. I mean, God is there for everybody, I suppose, but God is not solely there for the good people. God is there for the people who are being challenged, who are being hurt. And, there's a kind of spirituality, which we all know, and there's nothing wrong with it, that suggests that we should, in our prayer lives, somehow associate ourselves with the suffering of Christ on the cross. This reverses that a bit, because in this book, what Rodrigues realizes is that Christ is identifying with the sufferings of those who are suffering. And that certainly is, certainly in contemporary theology, that's a big move, right? And I think in Endo's struggling with this story. He's got the same problem that we have. It's the Odyssey. How do you handle this? But this notion that Christ is there with the sufferer, sharing the suffering, is never an answer to theodicy, but it's a bit of something to cling to, which is, I think, what happens in towards the end of the story here. That he can put his foot on the fumi, knowing that he still believes, because he sees that this is a Christ-like thing to do.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Well, when you're saying that, Christ comes not just for the good people, it makes me want to bring in another character.
Oh, I know you're going to talk about.
who, is in Rodrigues's kind of imagination of Christ, functions for him in his imagination as a Judas character much of the way, which is Kichijiro, who is the Japanese man who betrays him multiple times, but who follows him as well. And so for Rodrigues and his kind of biblical imagination, here is Judas, but I'm wondering, is Endo doing something a little more complicated than that with this figure?
Yeah, I wonder that too sometimes. So this guy Kichijiro, he's a real weasel, right? In fact, I think they say he looks like a rat at the beginning, and he has nothing going for him. And he is both, as you said, sort of alternates between a sort of cringing piety and simply self-protective abandonment of faith and of Rodrigues. And yet, as you said, he's always there. So, for me, I think he represents, in a fairly dramatic way, how most of us live our lives of faith. There are better moments and not such good moments. Now, hopefully, we don't sell out anybody for so many silver pieces on a classic Judas model. But it's almost like he's an alter ego for Rodrigues, that he's so human. And he accepts his humanity. It's very sinful humanity. It's very fallible humanity. And you juxtapose him with Rodriguez, who doesn't think he's that kind of person. And yet, what does he do? I mean, from a certain perspective, he goes in and out of faith, and he sells out Christ at the end. I mean, it's not that different. Yeah, so I think that, you can do what you like with it, but to my mind, this person is there for more than just, it's what you said, is there for more than just being ready to sell out, to be Judas. And of course, there's a point in the story where I think, is it Rodriguez? Someone, anyway, says that, of course, Christ didn't condemn Judas. You know? What you have to do, go do it. You're just part of the action. Yeah, the drama has to be played out. And Kichijiro is playing out the drama. And of course, the most, to my mind, the most important confrontation or meeting of the two of them is the very last pages in the book, or the very last pages of a narrative in the book, where after all these times, Kichijiro comes looking for absolution. And he sort of gets it. Yeah.
Well, one of the points that I find sort of poignant with Kichijiro is he says something to the effect at one point after he's, given him up, I can't remember the second, third, fourth time, is, well, if I had lived in a time where I wasn't being tortured, I would have been a good Christian.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I wonder, is that not in some ways a voice of many of us, right? If we were living in these conditions of torture, would we feel the same?
Yeah, yeah. So Rodriguez at one point, this is exactly it. Rodriguez, thinking about Kichijiro, says at one point, he says, Kichijiro was right in saying that all men are not saints and heroes. How many of our Christians, if only they had been born in another age from this persecution, would never have been confronted with the problem of apostasy or martyrdom, but would have lived blessed lives of faith until the very hour of their death. And if I remember correctly, I knew this was going to come up. Kichijiro says the same thing later on. He says, "Listen to me, Father," Kichijiro whimpered in a voice that the other Christians could hear. "I am an apostate. But if I had died 10 years ago, I might have gone to paradise as a good Christian, not despised as an apostate. Merely because I live in a time of persecution? I'm sorry." And it's a real point, right? I mean, we have it pretty cushy. In a scale of things, we have it pretty cushy. And there are so many people in this world who are living their faith, whatever religious tradition it is, and coping with enormous issues. And if they fail, there are reasons why. If we fail, it's our damn fault, because we're doing fine, thank you very much. So yeah, Kichijiro, that's a really, you could write a whole book or at least an essay about how do you measure holiness against the background of different kinds of social and political contexts. I think somewhere in the book it says something like, the weak can suffer as much as the strong, or is it the strong can suffer as much as the weak? But the point is there, I think. Yeah. Kichijiro, my favorite character in the whole book.
Yeah, because he's allowed to be so complex, right? And to be so flawed.
And we're better than him, so that's how we like him, right?
We can feel morally superior.
Yeah, that's right. We can feel morally superior for a time.
Well, you bring up the different contexts, and one of the things that I find interesting is when it happens in a couple of conversations. First, when Rodriguez is confronted with Ferreira finally, and then in a conversation with the Japanese magistrate Inoue as well. They come to this point where both Ferreira and Inoue say, the Japanese Christians, they don't really have a Christian God. There's something, this is another culture that just has a kind of Christian surface to it. Yeah. And Rodriguez seems to come to a different conclusion. He thinks they are, in fact, real Christians, right? But how does this novel, we haven't talked a lot about the sort of political and cultural context, but how does this novel invite us to think about how the understanding of God gets enculturated? That is, it shows up in different cultures in different ways. Even if the God is the same, how that God is expressed might be different.
Yeah, well, I think there's two issues there. One is the same God being interpreted differently, and the other is, are there incompatible religious systems vying with one another? Inoue's point, although he was baptized at one point, right? Inoue's point is that Christianity is fine for Europe. We have no quarrel. Go there and be good Christians. It doesn't belong here. You cannot plant Christianity in this soil. Now, as a matter of fact, there may have been political reasons why he came to that conclusion, because there was a lot of suspicion of the economic activity of the Portuguese and the Dutch and the British in their different ways, and they were all eventually expelled. Rodriguez makes the point, I think, that it's not fair to say that these people, so Ferreira is saying, well, they're not really Christians. They're just papering over their own tradition with some Christian ideas for whatever reason. And Rodriguez, I think, basically points to the pit and says, I don't think so. These people are taking this seriously. Now, we may not necessarily understand or even altogether approve of the way in which they have received the tradition, but they, by their own lights, seem to be faithful to that tradition. And, of course, I had another date on my little cheat sheet here. In 1865, so what are we going, 250 years later, Japan opens up again to the West, and people begin to, merchants and so on, and I think some missionaries begin to visit, and they find what they have always called crypto-Christians. There are people there, mostly I think in rural areas, who are still practicing some kind of recognizable Christian behavior. They don't have priests, they can't have mass, but they have preserved this for 200 years. Well, gee, it must have meant something to them, you would think. Just as, at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of the section where Rodriguez arrives in Japan and goes to these rather poor rural communities, they have no priests. But they have created a kind of little ecclesiology for themselves, right? They have a bunch of, right? Yep. They have a bunch of people who are sort of in charge of the ritual, so like the priests, and a bunch of people who are in charge of everyday affairs, like deacons, and they seem to be doing fine. They'd like to have mass and they'd like to have the priests and so on, but they're doing the best they can. And again, that doesn't look like something that is antithetical to being Japanese.
Well, and as you said earlier, how easy we have it here, and here how hard these people have it, and yet how much are they living out, the common priesthood of all believers in their lives, right? Maybe more so than many of us in easier situations.
Well, they were forced to live out the common priesthood of all believers. In Western Christianity and Catholicism, probably more than most, we haven't, over the centuries, needed. We should have recognized the common priesthood of all believers, but ever since Luther made such a big fuss about that, we Catholics have tended to go in the other direction. And if you have so many priests, who needs the common priesthood of all believers? I think, we're getting off the point, but I think when Pope Francis talks about synodality, we're being nudged back in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we will return to our clerical figure here for one more question, which is, he's denied the martyr's ending. And so in so many ways, a story that you might expect to be a saint's tale, right, doesn't look like a traditional hagiography at the end of it, a traditional life of the saint. But can we see in Rodriguez's life still, and perhaps even in his apostasy, holiness?
Yeah. I think we have to. Otherwise, the book it didn't need to be written. I mean, there is those people who might have seen the movie, the Scorsese movie, or might go and see it, and it's a very good movie till the end. And I think at the end it abandons the ambiguity. So I don't know, shouldn't give away the ending of a movie, so I'll leave that alone. But in the book, we are left with someone whose outward behavior is to be a good Japanese Buddhist, really, but whose inner strength continues to be his commitment to Christ, I think. I mean, it shows up. I think this is the other thing I was picked out as we could. It shows up in the very last pages of the narrative. Where Kichijiro has come to see the priest after he's no longer a priest, and to get to ask him for absolution. And he gets it. It says, Kichijiro wept softly, then he left the house. The priest had administered that sacrament that only the priest can administer. No doubt his fellow priests would condemn his act as a sacrilege. That's the ones living the comfortable lives somewhere else, right? But even if he was betraying them, he was not betraying his Lord. He loved him now in a different way from before. Everything that had taken place until now had been necessary to bring him to this love. And then there's two lines at the end which could have come from Graham Greene's great novel, The Power and the Glory, which has some similarities to this. So Rodriguez says, and again, this is first person. It ends as first person, just the last sentence. Even now I am the last priest in this land. But our Lord was not silent. Even if he had been silent, my life until this day would have spoken of him. So I think, the ending is not the silence of God, but the presence of God shown in amazingly mysterious ways. Yeah.
Well, I think mystery and the author's words, an excellent place to conclude. But thank you so much, Paul, for this wonderful conversation.
Pleasure.
I deeply enjoyed it.
Our pleasure. Thank you. You too. It was fun.